At first glance, Donald Trump's ceasefire announcement looked like a victory for diplomacy. Headlines celebrated peace, markets celebrated stability, politicians celebrated themselves. But geopolitics has a habit of asking a very uncomfortable question: why now? Because wars rarely end when leaders suddenly become passionate. They usually end when the costs become unbearable. And this time, the cost had become enormous. For months, the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important waterways on the planet, sat at the center of a crisis threatening the global economy. This narrow passage, barely 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, carries nearly 20% of world's oil and LNG trade. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil move through it every single day. Think about that for a moment. A tiny stretch of water in the Middle East influences the fuel prices of a truck driver in India, an airline in Europe, a factory in China, and a stock trader on Wall Street. That is how interconnected the modern world has become. As tensions escalated, oil markets immediately reacted. Brent crude surged over $100 a barrel, and at one point it also touched $126. Shipping insurance costs jumped, freight rates increased, investors became nervous. Governments started recalculating inflation forecasts. Airlines worried about fuel costs, manufacturing industries worried about supply chains, and suddenly peace became fashionable again. Amazing how quickly humanity discovers diplomacy when oil starts behaving like a luxury product. The moment news of a ceasefire framework emerged, oil prices began falling. Stock markets rallied. Investors breathed a collective sigh of relief. That alone should tell you something that is unimaginable. The real battlefield was not just missiles and military hardware. The real battlefield was economics. And then came perhaps the most entertaining geopolitical movements of the entire episode. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif rushed to celebrate and amplify the ceasefire announcement almost as if Pakistan had personally negotiated the deal. There has been no moment for Pakistan to celebrate ever since its inception in 1947. So, whatever happens, it quickly jumps in and tries to celebrate, though it has nothing to do with it anytime. By the way, it is celebrated peace between Islamic country of Iran and jointly fought by America and Israel. America, who is brotherly nation to Israel, is currently the father of Pakistan. Pakistani blood only craves money. Well, you give a few dollars to Islamic Republic of Pakistan and they will term Holy Quran as haram. Geopolitics can be fascinating place. Sometimes countries shape history. Sometimes they simply arrive early for the victory. Because this crisis exposed a truth many people still fail to understand. The modern world does not run on ideology. It runs on energy. Remove oil from the equation and suddenly inflation rises, transportation becomes expensive, food prices increases, industries slow down, stock markets panic, and governments start losing sleep. Every major conflict of the modern era teaches the same lesson. During the 1973 oil embargo, oil prices quadrupled and major economies entered recession. During the Gulf War of the 1990s, every market reacted before military objectives were even achieved. During the Iraq War, energy security became just as important as military strategy. And today, once again, the Strait of Hormuz reminded the world that geography still controls economics. We live in an age where people talk about artificial intelligence, quantum computing, space exploration, and futuristic technologies. Yet, one shipping lane was enough to shake the entire global economic system. That should humble everyone. And this is where India's story becomes truly interesting. India is world's third largest consumer of oil and imports a significant majority of its crude requirements. 20 years ago, a disruption of this scale would have created severe economic pressures. Yet India today is in a far stronger position. Over the last decade, India diversified energy supplies, strengthened strategic petroleum reserves, expanded refinery capacity, and built relations across multiple geographical camps. The real story is not that oil went up 65%. The real story is that when the global shock hit everyone, Pakistan fuel prices jumped around 64%, America's roughly about 30%, Britain's 13%, China's 11%, while India managed to keep the increase in a single digits. Geopolitics is not tested when everything is calm. Geopolitics is tested when the world catches fire. While many nations remain dependent on one or two strategic partners, India has developed working relationships with countries that often disagrees with one another. And that is not accidental. This is the strategy. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India has steadily built ties with the United States, Russia, Israel, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, France, and numerous other power centers simultaneously. Critics often struggle to classify this approach because it does not fit traditional Cold War thinking. But geopolitics is not a school debate competition. Countries do not receive trophies for loyalty. They survive by protecting their interests. And perhaps this is where leadership style becomes fascinating. President Trump is undoubtedly one of the most vocal political leaders of our era. He dominates social media, headlines, and press conferences like very few people can. Whether you agree with him or disagree, he understands attention better than almost everyone. But attention and influence are not always the same thing. Because while Trump is often speaking to the world, a prime minister sitting in Delhi has spent years building relationships across the world. Not through tweets, through trusts. Not through headlines, through handshakes. Not through viral moments, through long term strategic engagements. Think about it. India today can speak to Washington, Moscow, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and several competing power centers without being viewed as hostile by any of them. In geopolitics, that is an extraordinary position to occupy. Most countries eventually choose a camp. India increasingly chooses its interest, and perhaps that is one of Modi's major achievements. He understood something fundamentally about international relations. In a crisis, friendships become assets. Relationships become insurance policy. While conflicts erupt and supply chains break down, nations do not suddenly start making friends. They rely on relationships they spend years building. The headline may belong to the leaders speaking the loudest, but the outcome often belongs to the leaders preparing the longest. While the world was watching press conferences and social media announcements, India was benefiting from years of diplomatic investments already. Because in geopolitics, the strongest move is often the move nobody notices until the crisis begins. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson from this entire episode. People often believe that superpowers control everything, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes a narrow waterway controls them. The United States possesses unmatched military power. China possesses enormous manufacturing power. Europe possesses advanced economies, yet all of them were forced to pay attention to a single maritime choke point carrying one-fifth of world's energy trade. That is the power of geography. That is the power of economic pressure. And that is why Trump's ceasefire announcement was never just about peace. It was about inflation. It was about markets. It was about energy security. It was about economic stability. Politicians may speak the language of values. Markets speak the language of costs. And when those costs become high enough, even bitter rivals suddenly discover the benefits of negotiations. So perhaps the real story isn't that a ceasefire happened. The real story is that the global economy forced everyone back to the table. The Strait of Hormuz reminded the world that power is not measured only in tanks, missiles, and fighter jets. Power is measured in trade routes, shipping lanes, energy flows, and strategic relationships. And if there is one lesson India should take from all of this, it is simple. In the 21st century, the nations that understand energy, security, economic resilience, and long term diplomacy will shape the future far more than the nations that merely dominate headlines. Trump may understand headlines, Modi understands relationships. Headlines dominate for a day, relationship can protect a nation for decades.